All right, let's get started. So a huge and a warm welcome to everybody who has joined us today. We are talking about in this webinar really about one of the most critical and most fundamental topics for us as humanity, I would say. And with me, I have two really accomplished leaders and must say two dear friends who have joined us today. As all of you would know, the topic of discussion today is global circularity, walking the talk. Now, first of all, circularity, as everybody would understand, is really important. The very important part is that why are we not walking the talk? There has been so much written about this, so much spoken about it. And as we will discuss during the webinar today, actually, if you start looking at some of the metrics, circularity in the world has gone down over the last 12 to 18 months instead of continuing a positive trend upwards. So essentially, why is circularity important? That I will just come to. But before that, let me introduce my two panelists for the day. First, we have Rohit Pathak with us. Rohit is the CEO of the copper business at Hindalco. It's the largest copper player in the country. He has worked at McKinsey earlier on in his career and then was the principal EA to Mr. Kumar Mangalam Birla, the group chairman of the Birla Group, of the Aditya Birla Group. And he has also been the president of the Indian Electrical and Allied Electronics Association. Welcome, Rohit. It's a privilege and a pleasure to have you here. The other individual who I would like to introduce is John Willis. John has been an old dear friend of mine for the last couple of decades. Currently, he's the director at Planet Tracker, a non-profit financial think tank focused on aligning capital markets with planetary boundaries. By the way, um, I was reading somewhere, John, 6 of the 9 key planetary boundaries that measure environmental health across land, water, and air have been broken. Okay, so it'll be great to understand and see what you guys are doing, and especially your opinions on this. So John has about 30 years of experience in the financial industry, working in roles such as research, portfolio management, and trading. He used to head the research function at Deutsche Asset Management earlier, and has also co-founded Sustainable Insight Capital Management. So with that, let me sort of set the context of, what are we going to talk about today? In terms of an agenda for the remaining 55, 56 minutes, I would take 4 to 5 minutes and talk about circularity, why circularity is important, is it progressing or regressing? Then we would have a poll after that. And then we would get into 2 sessions from 5:10 to 5:25 and from 5:25 to 5:40 IST, where I would, in the beginning, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, present a few slides, then get our experts to comment on the topics that I have discussed in those slides. So this we will do over 2 mini sessions between 5:10 to 5:40. From 5:40 to 6 o'clock, the last 20 minutes, we will take up questions. So as we are going along, please do type out your questions that you want to ask the panelists as we are going along. And please type this out in the Q&A window and not in the chat window. So with that, would just like to request my colleagues to bring up the first slide. So what is circularity? I'll just read it out from here. In circularity, or a circular economy, products and materials are designed for reuse, recycling, recovery, or remanufacturing to maximize their lifespan, minimize waste, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and natural resource depletion. The principal ways of doing it is to eliminate wastage, circulate products and materials at their highest value in the value chain, and regenerate nature to the extent possible. If we were to achieve 100% circularity, look at these outcomes that could happen for us on the planet. $4.5 trillion of economic value by 2030, creation of 7 to 8 million new jobs, a 40% reduction in global GHG, and of course, drop in municipal waste generation and reduction in direct municipal solid waste management costs. So as you can see, through the process of manufacturing, consumption, and reuse and recycling, which is what the circular economy is, there is so much that can be done. However, when we look at the reality of the situation right now, as per this report by Circular Economy Foundation and Deloitte, if you really look at it, there's so many discussions and debates and articles that get published. There are all kinds of conferences that are organized. Everybody commits at the country level, at industry level, individual company level. What we are seeing is actually the global circularity rate has dropped from 9.1% in 2018 to 7.2% in 2023, marking a 21% decline. Now, there could be some arguments made that there was a COVID shock to the entire world, which might have led to this, but still these numbers are alarming to some extent, if not to a very large extent. If you look at material consumption, during the same period, global material consumption has surged to 500 gigatons, equivalent to total consumption throughout the 20th century. And this, if I remember correctly, is the last 6 years, right? And of course, people have talked about this particular fact earlier, but high-income countries like the US, Japan, UK, account for 25% of this consumption, although they only have 7% of the people. And then if you look at the virgin material extraction, it is 2x the rate of global population, which means that the resources of our natural resources in the world are getting consumed at a much faster pace than what is desired. So overall, in this webinar, we are going to talk about these issues. Why is this happening? And what should we do about it? I mean, enough talk. We now need to do something serious and take this up very, very on an urgent basis. So that is the overall context. With this, maybe we can just get on to the first poll. So please just fill this out. All right, so we should get the results right now. At least the sample that we have on the webinar today, 43% think that this is lack of infrastructure, which is the primary reason for circularity not keeping pace. The second one is lack of specific regulations and consumer awareness. People think it's only 23%. All right, great. So that was the context setting for the webinar. Let us first then dive into the first segment where we will really talk about, who are some of the key stakeholders, and from a country perspective, what is happening on the front runner side and the laggard side. So as you can see on this slide, the front runners are clearly, and not surprisingly, more of the European countries like Germany, Netherlands, France, and Italy, but even Japan and China one always has different kinds of perceptions, but China seems to be doing relatively speaking, a reasonable job of trying to increase circularity, whether it's in terms of higher recycling rates, higher resource productivity, reduced waste management cost, reduced land usage, and reduced energy consumption. Now, some of the other countries, which by the way includes India, who seem to be falling behind the curve, includes, besides India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, where obviously some good things are definitely happening, but maybe the implementation can be done much faster. Now, if you look at the other stakeholders and some of the challenges that are being faced in each one of these stakeholder set, if you will, policymakers, obviously, they're responsible for setting up regulations, providing incentives, creating frameworks that encourage businesses and consumers to adopt circular practices. There's clearly a lack of strict policies for promoting circular economy. There are insufficient financial incentives, and there are huge infrastructural gaps in recycling systems. When it comes to industries, clearly high upfront costs in new technologies, especially for smaller and medium enterprises, which in any economy, they form a large part of the GDP and large part of the output of that economy. How are they supposed to, where are they supposed to get the capital to put into these technologies? Very, very complex supply chains. And Rohit, as you might recall, on one of the things that we had talked about earlier, supply chains in this space end up being extremely complicated. And then, of course, consumer behavior and consumer elasticity of demand, pricing elasticity of demand, consumers don't want to pay, right? So industries face all those challenges. And finally, for consumers, obviously, there is lack of awareness. There is a higher cost for them. And then even the consumer behavior at the last mile level around waste segregation and disposal, how much compliance there really is around that. So this was some of the more important aspect that we would like to cover in this segment for the next 12 minutes. With that, maybe if I could invite you, John, to give us your thoughts and ideas around some of these topics around at the country level, at the ecosystem level, and the stakeholder level. What do you see is happening and so on?
Thank you very much, Ashish, and thank you very much for inviting me. As ever, Ashish, you and your company raise many, many important issues and thought-provoking ones as well. So I'm not going to pretend I can answer everything, because I'd need the brain the size of a planet to answer all the issues that you've raised. But let me just raise a few points, if I may. So the stakeholders that you mentioned, I was thinking of that in relation to the poll that you ran at the beginning. And if I was answering that, I would actually put it down to policymakers. I absolutely understand why people gave the other answers, but I would argue that if you had the policies in place to ensure recycling, reuse, etc., the infrastructure is going to follow. And I would argue, for example, that in renewable energy, that's what we've seen. We've seen incentives, subsidies, etc., to get renewables going, and from that, the infrastructure grows. But I would also, with your audience, say that there's another key stakeholder, and I think that's the financial community. So that's investors, lenders, because I think they can also affect change. But the reality is that they're often torn, and they're torn because I generally believe that most people want to live within planetary boundaries that you mentioned. What do we mean by that? We mean a safe space for humanity. It's as simple as that, a safe space for humanity. And I generally do not believe that people want to destroy this planet. But these shareholders are also having to look after their investments. And if I start talking about recycling, reuse, etc., what are the costs of that? And is that detrimental to my investments, which they're being paid to look after? So you can begin to see sort of some of the complexity and the challenges that they face. And you said right at the beginning, and I completely agree, this is a very, very complex area. But I think one of the ways it can be made less complex is, and I know it's a bit of a cliche, but forgive me, is a level regulatory playing field. And I think there's an example that we can use that is playing out in front of everyone at the moment. So let's take one of the products that there's a lot of discussion about recycling, and that's plastics. And at the moment, we are debating a global plastics treaty. In fact, in the fourth quarter is supposed to be the final round of those discussions. The reality is those discussions have not gone particularly well if you want to promote recycling, reuse, and a more sustainable world. That is the reality. But within that and the various groups, there is a group of consumer companies, and it's many well-known companies and brands that people in the audience would know the names of, called the Business Coalition for a Plastics Treaty. What is their issue? Their issue is absolutely change the rules, but make it the same for everyone. In other words, don't permit regulatory arbitrage. So what I mean by that is you apply one set of rules in the European Union, for example, but a different set of rules in the US, which means that I'll go to the cheaper place. And these companies are obliged to look at their bottom line. So there are groups of companies trying to affect change, but they don't want to be damaged economically by being a leader. And the final thing that I will say, because I think that obviously I'm coming from civil society and we all want good, but we've always got to be mindful of the challenges. I think we often talk about stranded costs in various ways. In other words, an asset is built, is invested in, but then circumstances change. I think what we have to bear in mind from a company point of view is that stranded costs, there's a symmetry. So civil society often says, well, if you don't do this, you will become, there will be stranded assets because the world is moving on. But what if your government is not moving that quickly? If you're too far ahead of the government, they can also become stranded. So I just encourage people to look at things like stranding and timing in relation to policy on both sides. So essentially what it tells you is, if you're a company, do not lag government policy, but if you're too far ahead of government policy, you also carry risks. So I'll stop there, Ashish.
Very interesting, John. And I will come back to you. Very, very deep questions to be asked on what you said. Over to you, Rohit. What are your thoughts?
And thanks, John, and thanks, Ashish, for the good tee up to this discussion. And maybe, I'll just give a slightly different view to start with, different perspective to start with, and then I'll come to a couple of the core issues. I think to me, this is a lot more to do with the societal challenge and to some extent, financial market-driven growth challenge, right? Societal challenge more from the angle that, look, if you go back 100 years, which Ashish, you mentioned in the 20th century, most of the villages or small cities were pretty much circular and self-sufficient, right? You saw what you were generating, you figured out solutions of how to solve for it and ensure your area is not getting cluttered, and you reused a lot of that stuff in ways that you could reuse. However, as from there we move to globalization, where the production centers moved away from your places of stay. I think this challenge has grown in a way where it's got to a level where it's very difficult to manage, right? Because you're not seeing the impact, direct impact of whatever you're doing. And this notion of circularity and having a complete ecosystem is sort of gone, right? And it's difficult now to think about this as a global community because we are stuck in that zone of who will go ahead and who will get stayed behind. So we are still running the race, with each other. And not wanting to collaborate as much, whether it's a global treaty, whether it's a regional FTA or any type of discussion, it's still a race that we are as a society and as countries involved in. The second is, I think, what John was, talking about in terms of the financial incentives. The financial incentives are not still encouraging recycling. They're still pushing for growth, right? And how will growth come from? By increasing consumption, right? The financial markets look at only growth as one of the key metrics for the valuations that you get on your stock. And as a company, if you're not creating more consumption and advocating more consumption, where actually consumers don't need that extra consumption, but you're creating the consumption and the need for consumption, which will finally end up using more resources, right? If not done in a circular manner, recycled manner. And I think that we have set up our ecosystem and the global economy in such a way that the societal behavior and economic behavior is pushing us faster into a non-recycling or non-circular economy and construct. Having said that, I think if we were to think of now regulation, as John was mentioning, and we think of actually the right financial mechanisms, circularity can be done. All right, it's not something which is not possible to be done. I think renewables and solar was a fantastic example where renewable energy has got created at a scale across countries through government subsidies, and hence the government policies of how you incentivize and get economy to start on circularity is a very, very important metric on this. I think smart mechanisms around uh, business models can also be done to catalyze circularity at a more micro level of a community. For example, Ashish, I'm sure you will remember, John, I don't know whether it was true in your days or no, but we all grew up where Coke was available or Thumbs Up was available in glass bottles. And, you give, after drinking, you give back the bottle and you will get some money back, right? And that system worked because the collection was 100%. No one wanted to give up that 1 or 2 rupees because it was there. And somewhere down the line, we moved to plastics, where this incentive was destroyed, right? And we designed our supply chains and industries around non-circularity. That I think can be changed, right? And I think, for example, if I look at two of the products that our company is in, which is aluminium and copper. Aluminium, Novelis is the largest recycler of aluminium and aluminium cans in the world. We collect more than 2.5 million tons of aluminium annually, which we recycle and repurpose for making fresh cans. And by the way, the consumer also pays a premium for those cans because it is green, and the whole ecosystem has got set across the world. It's not just in US, but it's Europe, US. Asia, it's pan continents that we are doing this. So I think if the right regulations and incentivization is created by the financial markets, I think there is a way to get into the right mechanisms at scale. In copper, for example, we are now setting up the first e-waste recycling facility in India. Because we know there's enough copper waste available. It is getting used in some way or the other. And if we were to process it in the right way, we can actually repurpose it much better for the public, right? And hence it makes economic case. Yes, you need government support. You need some regulatory support because it is not going to be easy to do it in a formal economy. in this, but I think it can be done. So I think it's a it's a multifaceted challenge. We will not be able to solve it, by only looking at regulations. It has to be a mix of regulations, financial incentives, and uh, corporate involvement, which we need to look at. And finally, is consumers, as us, all of us as consumers, to be conscious about it, right?
Right, right. No, excellent, Rohit. Very interesting thoughts, and we already start seeing some questions appear in the Q&A window. We'll definitely come back to you on some of the ideas that you have presented here. So I think this is a good, and especially your last comment, Rohit, it's a good segue into our next section. So with that, Prabhat, if you can bring up the next poll. And may I also request the audience to please keep on posting their questions in the Q&A window, because I'm sure, given the expertise we have on the panel here, there are some questions which have been bothering you. We should definitely make use of this time with John and Rohit. All right, I think we can bring up the results. So on the first question, what role should governments play, as has been very clearly articulated by both John and Rohit, clearly a very, very important role, especially around incentives. Second question was around industries. I guess, yeah, it's about 50% people are saying we should align our business goals with circularity. I mean, easier said than done, but clearly that's the way to go forward. And in terms of consumers, wow, 100% people say that, oh, there seems to be some error here, right, in this question. Okay, so it gives all the same options. Okay, let's move on. Now, talking about, the basic policy making that is going on. And that's the next segment. If we can bring up the slide. If you look at across investments, incentives, and grants and strategies, there's a bunch of good work which is happening. Whether it's, look at these various funds which have been allocated by the European Commission, Netherlands, France, China, Japan. By the way, the same countries which we had highlighted earlier that they're doing interesting work, whether it's in terms of incentives, tax incentives, or otherwise. And then clearly around grants and strategies, different kinds of strategies. For example, China seems to have this very interesting dual circulation strategy, prioritizing domestic consumption and balancing international trade, supporting the second-hand and remanufacturing industries. Similarly, if you look at Netherlands, they have this partnership going on for circular financing. France has this anti-waste law. Italy has these tax incentives. So clearly, there's a lot of policy making which is going on. The problem, of course, is that there seems to be, a little bit of policy which has happened in some countries. Is it happening at scale? Is it happening across the world? Is it happening in the largest economies? And this report that I was talking about actually breaks up all the countries into three categories. One is growth, one is developed, and there is a third category of also of developing nations. And all of them have different imperatives and different challenges because they are in different life cycles of their economic evolution. And it is sort of very unfair to say that, look, developing countries should do this and that, but me, I'm a developed country for the last 50 years, and I'll keep on emitting forever. So I think, John, to your point around this global alliance, I mean, global treaty, if that could be made to happen, it can have wonderful effects, and would love you to comment on that when I come to you. In terms of, if you look at individual organizations, clearly, again, there is a lot of interesting activity. If you look in the consumer industry, a lot of these companies have this net zero deadlines and internal, targets, 2030, 2035, 2040. However, again, very sad to see that I was looking at the numbers for one of the companies. Their effectively, their carbon footprint has gone up. It's a global company. Their carbon footprint has gone up last year as compared to 2 years back. So companies are doing something, but are they doing enough? And maybe some of the things that you spoke about, Rohit and John, around financial incentives, managing stock markets and capital markets, which reward growth, which means that you have to get consumers to consume more. By the way, interestingly, I'm reading a book on ultra processed foods these days, and the food system as such, the entire food system is incentivized to make people consume more. All of us on average are eating more than we need in the world, right? So how do you balance it out, the pressures between capital markets and shareholder value versus circularity? And the final point I wanted to make was around at the consumer level also, you see, and to your point, John, maybe some of these are driven by civil society. There are a lot of these consumer initiatives, consumer-led initiatives, whether it's the repair cafes in Netherlands or it's the sustainable fashion movements. Um, Somebody was telling me about one of the global clothing brands. Uh, I mean, I don't know, they produce 12,000 new kinds of shirts every year. They're designing, redesigning, relaunching, and then you have fashion zone, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, that fashion trend is gone and something else gets produced. So clearly we need more sustainability in fashion. And then and so on. Okay, so I've already taken a lot of time. With this context, I would like to invite you, Rohit, first. If you can please take about 4 or 5 minutes, 4 minutes, to comment on all these things, and what is your take on this, whether it's countries, organizations, consumers, and so on.
I think you across each of these areas will find enough pockets of excellence where something good is happening, right? I think the challenge is, can that pocket of excellence be taken wide enough where it can have material impact? Like you're talking of food, the same is, let's say, the fashion industry, right? You are encouraging people to use clothes just once in a year, right? That's how the overall economic, the industry is set up. And the clothing is not being made with recycled material today, right? So you are going to create an aspirational value in the society where people will consume more, and it will create a lot more waste than what the industry can handle. So I think, to me, one of the things is, how can we and look, all the big companies which are creating this scale are finally all listed companies, right? Or big companies which are somewhere responsible, responsibly listed companies. So I think one key element is, how will the financial markets begin to start incentivizing and giving that premium to push companies to be more circular, right? For example, as Hindalco, one of the stands we had taken is, look, we will expand our capacity once we are clear that we can do it on renewable, right? But the financial markets is mixed on it. Some will say, oh, no, but you should expand. There's so much of growth to be done, right? They will not give you a premium for. They'll give you more premium for growth than for circular growth. right? And I think that's something which, look, unless we are able to fix that basic thing, corporates will struggle to respond to this challenge, even if they want to. That's, I think, one point that I wanted to make. Having said that, I think, look, there are ways in which you can create uh, economic models to create, around this. For example, when I look at copper recycling, which is an industry which we are into, one of the key assumptions is that by putting in an investment in the technology, I can more efficiently recover material from the waste. And that extra recovery is something that will justify paying a premium to bring that material into the organized from the unorganized. And if we are able to do that, right, it's economic model that I'm creating around, around the industry. In India today, I think we have done a very good job of last mile connectivity of delivery, right? What if someone was to now convert that into a reverse chain? It's combined with the delivery to collect back waste for economic value, right? And that waste repurpose into making new products, right? Possible.
Rohit, sorry,
It's
just one more minute, please.
Yeah,
Just one
sure.
minute.
Yeah, right. So I think it's very possible, and I think if we are able to think innovatively on some of these models, I feel we can get out of this, because finally, I don't think regulation, with the way geopolitics is today, will be able to handle this, and come to any conclusion over the next several years. Right? We'll have a lot of debates, but we won't get to any things. I think it'll be up to society and corporates to come up innovatively around some models which can be scaled up, which will increase the recycled and circular component of their businesses. And I think that's worth doing across sectors.
Great. Very nice thoughts, Rohit. With that, over to you, John. John, we're just a couple of minutes behind time right now, so maybe 3-4 minutes from you. 4 minutes maybe.
No problem. So I'm just going to focus on two things, Ashish, because again, you've got lots of issues, thought-provoking issues. So I'm going to look at it from a corporate viewpoint. I'm going to look at it from a consumer viewpoint. And I'm deliberately going to put some provocative things out there. So let's talk about corporates, and let's talk about sustainability targets, which will often focus on circularity. And by the way, for those interested, on our website, we did a whole analysis looking at what, in fact, we were looking at the plastic value chain, and we were looking at what did they talk about? What did they want to promote to people? By far, the most used term was circularity. By far. Okay, multiples of any other term. And I do believe that many corporates find it a very comfortable term. It covers a lot of things. It's actually, in some cases, it's a bit sort of vague. What's interesting is what they don't talk about. So they don't like to mention toxins or pollution or bioplastics or biodegradable. So look at what they don't mention. So I think that's interesting in the messaging they're given. But let me flip it around. There's been a lot of focus recently on corporates changing these targets, and often in relation to what they're going to recycle or whatever. But I think as investors, the financial markets have got to think about this quite carefully. If you give a profit warning, so that's nothing to do with sustainability, I'm not going to make the profits, you have to release it to the market under practically all regulations, and the market will then adjust the valuation. I don't think it's unreasonable, as corporates learn more and more about recycling and circularity, inevitably some of those targets will change. But if they go out there and say, actually, we've learned we can't get hold of the recycled product, that's seen as a negative. But maybe we should admire the honesty in that and maybe view it like profit warnings and things. So I just put it out there that I think if we're challenging these companies, you've also got to allow them to say, things didn't quite work out the way I wanted, and evaluate that. The final thing I want to say is on the consumer side. I think that often you'll hear from the corporates or policymakers, well, it's up to the consumers to decide. But the problem is that a lot of the information is asymmetric. They are not given enough facts, but neither can you put all these facts on a label, because you're going to look at it and go, well, I can't see the product. But they're not given all the facts. Companies are brilliant at marketing. So just consider the next time you look at a product, I encourage all your audience, if you're looking at a sustainable product, you will often see words like green or sustainable or bio or eco-friendly. In fact, we did an analysis, all those came up. I'm not sure, and probably you're not sure what those mean. They're very comfortable words, but what do they actually mean? So I think to blame the consumer is not fair, because they often don't have the information. The final thing on that I would say is, if we did a poll and said what products are recycled, I almost guarantee that high up the list would become plastics. But the fact is that 91% of plastics are not recycled. And the reason people think that is because the chemical industry and oil industry has put enormous amounts of marketing into the idea that it is recyclable. But at the moment, it's not being recycled.
Wow. Wow. Very, very interesting. Okay, so now I think we come to the last 20 minutes approximately. And I guess this is where the rubber hits the road in some sense, because people have been asking some questions. Hi, Michael. Maybe I can start with your question first. By the way, Rohit, Michael is also ex-McKinsey. Elsa, apologies that third poll was indeed wrong. We had the same questions, so apologies for that. But maybe, John, I can ask you this question that has been posed by Michael. He is referring to my first slide where I said, look, if we get circularity right, it will lead to GDP growth or some GDP output. Okay. So he's asking, how does that happen? John, you're on mute.
Apologies. You think I would have got used to that by now? I mean, it obviously it can happen if you're getting new investment, new jobs, and they're happening at a greater rate than those that you are closing down in effect. And actually, you know, many people would say the renewables industry and all the industry related to that has been quite important to GDP growth. But what you haven't seen is obviously the oil industry in that particular case sort of shutting down. So you could say that the jury is out. I think the relationship with GDP that is most important is what Rohit was mentioning about your consumption. So if you look at the relationship between single-use plastic, by the way, of all plastic we use, about 40% is single-use plastic, okay, a frightening number. But if you look at single-use plastic consumption and the relationship between GDP per head on a PPP basis, the regression is about 98%. So there's a very, very close connection between consumption of these products and GDP growth. That is the one that we certainly focus on.
Right. Right. Rohit, the next question is for you. Somebody's asking, what do you think about your company offering incentives to your copper customers for recycling their copper waste? This could promote sustainable copper growth and foster customer loyalty. So sort of green copper.
No, so look, I think the question is actually the reverse, that look, if I make green copper for which I'm putting an investment, will some of my customers actually, pay me a little premium to cover for the cost of green copper, right? Because the collection of that will be different and maybe costlier because I have to pay a premium to be able to get it from the unorganized into the organized market, yeah, right? Where there is going to be some, uh, taxation which will be very different from the unorganized market, which we will have to follow. But I think, look, I do strongly believe that once we get started and start sourcing, this will become a sustaining. Copper is a very expensive material. If it is recycled in the right way with the right quality, I think this is a win-win for people along the chain. Yes, there will be a few people who may get hurt a little bit in the chain, but on the overall basis, the ecosystem will benefit, in my view, if we were to formally recycle the material. And I think there is value in the right technology and the right environmental investments to be done to make it happen in the right way.
Right. John, next question for you is around the whole regulatory environment. And I think both of you spoke a lot about that, policy making, regulations. So, in the context of the Global Plastics Treaty that you mentioned, and then you also mentioned regulatory arbitrage. Is that treaty trying to solve the problem of that regulatory arbitrage also?
Yes, it is. It's trying to make it applicable across the whole of the globe. Now, the problem that we got, let me do the negative first. Let's get the negative out the way. Let's be honest, we're not very good as a planet on these multilateral agreements. In fact, the last really successful one was the Montreal Protocol, which many of you will remember was to look after the ozone layer. And then there was a Kigali Agreement a few years after, which expanded HFCs and CFCs, etc. That's really been the last successful one. Now they're trying to do the same. And this, by the way, if it was passed, that's a big if it was passed, would be a legally binding instrument. That is stronger than the statements that you're getting out, the climate COPs and things. It would be a legally binding, which is why it's so difficult. So that all sounds terribly negative. But they're exactly trying to do, Ashish, what you're saying. They're worried that if one country says, well, I'm not signing up, then all producers will go to that country because they will get beneficial terms. I mean, why wouldn't you do that from a financial point of view? And that's why they're trying to close down. Now, there is actually hope. It has not gone well to date. However, the word coming out, they're now doing these sessions in between the main negotiations. And the US, which was a big blocker of this, has now said that it's mindful of supporting this treaty. So that is a major move if that actually happens. So we're not without hope. I think there's still a lot of work to do, but if it happens, it would apply across all countries. And things, remember, this isn't just recycling. You're also dealing with hazardous chemicals within, particularly plastic.
Right. Okay. Next question for you, Rohit. You had talked about business models. You talked about the tension between circularity-led growth versus shareholder value creation-led growth. And then both of you talked about the financial markets, capital markets, investor expectations. How do you piece all of this together? I mean, I know it's probably the holy grail of strategy that one can come up with, but what are some of the options that maybe you as a company have, or in general, any company, if they are trying to optimize across these conflicting targets? How do you do it?
Look, I think finally you have to take a call let's say for example, as Aditya Birla Group or Hindalco, if we believe in something is right to be done, right, we are willing to invest behind it with a medium to long term outlook, right? Maybe in the short term, the financial markets will question you and say, oh, why are you doing this? This is not the right investment. Will it give return X, Y, and Z? But if we think it is the right thing to do, we are okay saying we will put our money where we think the opportunity lies, and we will make it work. So I think, to me, there is conviction of an entrepreneur and leadership which has to go behind saying this is the right thing to do for not just the company but also for the country or for the region or for the depending on the company, at a global level. And we will put investment behind that to make it work. Yes, I think you have to still work hard to try and get the economic value created. Sometimes you do need to ask for incentives from the government to incentivize that, to give it a bit of a early start. And I think we do that right across. When I say we, I'm saying as an industrial community, by and large, we will go and ask for some of these things that we think can be made to catalyze these investments. But look, finally, the option of saying, okay, we will wait for it and we'll let someone else do it and then we'll copy it is not there, right? If you want to be a leader, and in most businesses, we want to be a leader or we are a leader, and there we have to lead the way of what we think is right, and right not just for the business but for the society and the nation, right? So we that's how our purpose is defined, to be responsible businesses, to build responsible businesses, right? And we will go the extra mile for that. And yes, hence maybe the growth is slightly slower than someone else, but if it is responsible, we know it will be long term more sustainable.
John, what is your take on the same question? Because you are ultimately trying to align capital markets with planetary boundaries. So you are at the heart of this, right? On one side, you have this capital market stakeholders. On the other side, we have the planet to worry about. So yeah, I mean, companies obviously, as Rohit is articulating, would struggle to to try and do the right thing, and at the same time, have the right outcomes for investors and the market. So, any thoughts on this? How do you try and balance it out?
Yeah, I always love hearing people like Rohit talk because they're ideal for me. And the reason that I say that is we interact, as you know, Ashish, a lot with investors and banks. That is our sort of major clientele, if you like. And where we start to see significant interest is when you get one or two leaders in a particular field. So if you have a copper company saying, actually, we're committed to recycling, immediately the investors are thinking, what have they spotted that the other companies haven't spotted? So they immediately start asking the other companies, why aren't you doing it? And we do come across these instances where you get a couple of companies, 2 or 3 companies break away from the group. That is incredibly powerful. And I can never thank chief executives enough for being brave enough to do that. Because as I said, if you get too far ahead of policy, there's a danger. So what we're asking these business leaders to do is just be ahead, which is a really difficult judgment. The other thing that where I'm very sympathetic with business leaders, and we've just, in fact, it's one of the companies that you identified. So a leader in fast-moving consumer goods that you identified is Unilever. It is seen as really trying quite hard. It's not perfect, but I don't know a perfect company, and it's incredibly difficult to achieve that. They announced that some of their targets, these recycling sustainability targets, were being changed, and the share price rose quite dramatically compared with the sector. Now, you're a corporate leader. What are you thinking? Now, was it down to them downgrading those? In fact, it was slightly misunderstood. They hadn't downgraded, but let's say that was the assumption. So am I giving an indication as an investor back off or keep going, but don't cost me any money. Keep giving me my share buybacks and my dividends. That was an interesting one. And I raise it, and I won't share the names of some other corporates who called us and said, how would you interpret that? Our investors saying to us, actually, don't go overboard. And that's the final thing I want to say. And again, it's a bit provocative, is it's interesting in that most investors, bankers, financiers would view the main risk on most of these targets being with the corporate. But I wonder if it's ultimately with the financial institutions. And the reason I say that is they have heavily promoted living in a better world, more sustainable investments, etc. If those companies don't achieve that, is it actually the company at risk or the investor who was promising it to their fund holders?
Right. Right. Yeah. Fascinating. Fascinating. I guess we have time for one more question. And then as we wrap up the webinar, you would get a short survey. So please do fill that out before you log out. Hi, Amrik. Amrik is a professor at Plaksha University. So his question is around how do you create a system of measurement? And as all of us know, only what you measure improves. How do you create a system of measurement to say that you're making progress? And maybe just quick 1 minute thoughts from both of you. Maybe John, you want to go first?
I leave it up to the professors to determine that exactly, but it's a very, very relevant question. So the market as a whole is in a bit of crisis about this, because look at the voluntary carbon market. There's lots of companies have pulled out of it because they think it can't be verified. And then I also look at some very, very well-known companies who are beverage companies. And if you go to the footnotes, the auditors actually say, I cannot verify this recycling target. So I think it's something that the auditors have got to get a grip on, quite frankly. There must be a way to do this. And maybe, as your guest mentioned, maybe they need some help from academia on how to do that. I'm not an expert on verification, but we've got to get it right.
So
Right.
I'll give a slightly different view. I think, I don't think the fear factor is as powerful, because, people will figure ways out. I think the incentivization is probably the better way to go on some of these areas. And I think metrics are, by the way, possible. So we report, for example, how much of our waste that we generate, how much are we reusing, right, in the manufacturing process itself. So we actually, it's there in the KRAs of all our people. We measure and track, how much of waste is being reused, repurposed for different applications which are value added. We report our recycling percentages for Novelis, which is into this business, and put it out there for tracking. So I think, look, if we really get to it, it's very possible. There are metrics for most of the things that can be done. But I think incentivization is the right way to go, not penalization, because we're too early for the penalizing phase. And there are too many options available for people to then play around if you go down that route, in my view.
All right. Great. Lots of other interesting questions which are there, but unfortunately, we're completely out of time. By the way, John, your message about auditors and the consulting advisory firms and the tax firms. We had some friends, some of my friends were there, but they have unfortunately left. I'll make sure your message goes to them. They were there from the Big Fours. So thank you so much. This was indeed a fascinating discussion, a very important discussion. And I think to whatever extent we have managed to raise awareness about the key questions and what might be some potential solutions around that. Just to remind everybody, a small form will come up, so please do fill that out. And thank you so much, John, and thank you so much, Rohit. Really, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.